Steve, and welcome to GPJFF in Conversation. It is truly an honor to bring back 50 Children, the rescue mission of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus, on the 81st anniversary of the children's monumental arrival to America's safe shores. The story of a Philadelphia couple who traveled to Nazi Germany and Austria to carry out what today is known as the largest transport of child refugees during the Holocaust is not just remarkable, it's ripe for a Hollywood blockbuster adaptation. I just have to know, have any Hollywood producers approached you for the rights to dramatize the story of Mr. and Mrs. Kraus?
Yes, Hollywood, from your lips to God's ears, as they say. And indeed, I agree with you completely. I think it's got all the elements, the story of making a really good feature film. And as a matter of fact, there is a production company, not in Hollywood, but actually in London. It's a great group of folks there who have been developing this project for the last couple of years. And fingers crossed, it's going to continue to develop, and one of these days, hopefully, we might see a version of Gil and Eleanor Kraus up there on the big screen, and we'll see where that goes.
All right, let's start at the very beginning. What inspired you to make this film?
Well, first of all, I want to just tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to be chatting with you like this and to share the film, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to bring the film back to Philadelphia. This is truly a Philadelphia story, this film, and it was wonderful for me to spend as much time as I did in Philly, both while I was making the film and after the film was done, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to be having this conversation with you, Olivia, and to be sharing the film again with folks there. There's only one reason why I was able to make this film, and that is years before I got involved in this at all. In fact, coming up on 20 years ago, I met a remarkable woman right here in San Francisco named Liz Purley, and 15 months after we met, Liz and I got married. Liz was one of 4 grandchildren of Gil and Eleanor Kraus. And Liz always knew that her grandparents had done this unbelievable thing years and years ago. She didn't necessarily know all the ins and outs of the story, but she certainly knew what they had done. And more importantly, she had a manuscript typed out on old-fashioned onion skin paper that her grandmother, Eleanor Kraus, had written recounting this episode. And Liz kept it just in a file drawer right upstairs in a little office that she had here at her home in San Francisco. And sometime after we got married, she pulled it out of that file drawer and handed it to me and said, "Oh, you might be interested in this." And I looked at it and I read it, and I didn't really believe a word of what I was reading. It sounded like a work of fiction. It sounded like a Hollywood movie. It just didn't sound real. But of course it was all true. And also in that same file drawer, there was a plastic bag filled with about a dozen German passports, all of them with Nazi insignia, all of them with a photograph of a young boy or a girl. And these were passports that her grandparents had somehow held on to for years and years. And that's when I began to think, maybe there's something to this. I had worked as a journalist for many years, working both as an editor and a reporter for newspapers and magazines, first in LA and then in Washington, D.C., and then in San Francisco. And I had never done anything in the film world. I certainly had never made a film. But I began to realize that I was sitting on this terrific story, and I began to think that it might make for a good documentary film, and that's what got me involved in turning this story into the documentary film.
As writer, director, and producer of 50 Children, like the Krauses, you must have met and overcome many challenges to realize your vision. What was it like wearing all three hats and shaping the film we see on screen today?
To be honest, Olivia, I never gave it that much thought in terms of what it meant to be a producer and a director and a writer of the film. Here's what I do remember. When I first thought that I would explore the idea of making this documentary film, I knew a couple of people here in the Bay Area who themselves were in the doc world. And so I just went to them and said, look, I've got this, what I think is a pretty good story, and I'm thinking of that it might make for an interesting film. One of them said, well, Steve, you can call yourself a producer, but maybe what you ought to think about, since you've never done this before, is, find somebody who will, direct the film, or, basically will make the film, and you call yourself a producer and, call it a day. And I don't know, I thought about it, and I thought, well, I don't know, why can't I do it, So the bottom line is, I started finding people who knew the film world, and who in particular knew the documentary film world. I ended up working with a terrific film editor, Ken Schneider. He and his wife have been making documentary films themselves for years, and Ken in turn introduced me to some cinematographers and other people who were doing all of the behind-the-scenes work that goes into a film of this sort. But in terms of doing the directing and the writing as well as the producing, I continue to think, no, I can do that, and it all worked out pretty well.
A few of Eleanor's journal entries seem to toe the line between memoir and poetry, especially those recounting meeting the parents of the 50 children. She writes, "To take a child from its mother seemed to be the lowest thing a human being can do. And yet it was as if we had drawn up in a lifeboat in a most turbulent sea. Every parent we met seemed to say, 'Here, yes, freely, gladly, take my child to a safer shore.'" Eleanor clearly had a way with words, and Liz definitely inherited her grandmother's knack for describing people and situations. Take Liz's portrayal of her grandmother. Instead of describing Eleanor as a devoted mother and housewife, she instead demonstrates the lengths she went through to create a beautiful home. She changed the slipcovers in the spring and took them off in the fall. Her observation doesn't just tell us who Eleanor was, it tells us what kind of person she was, and it tells us that we're in the hands of a reliable narrator. Now, it must have been natural to direct your wife in this interview, but can you talk about how you approach the other subjects in your film, especially the 9 of the 50 children you interview that have lived very full lives?
Olivia, I couldn't agree with you more about Eleanor's writing. She writes so beautifully about so many facets of this story, and it obviously worked to my great benefit to be able to draw on her words as the sort of focal point for telling the story of the 50 Children Rescue, and likewise to also be able to have Liz in the film talking about her grandparents and her grandmother in particular. Liz knew her grandparents in their later years, and even though they themselves never talked about this, it was wonderful for me to be able to have Liz appear in the film talking about both her grandparents, but in particular those wonderful descriptions of Eleanor Kraus. Sadly, Liz passed away from breast cancer a couple of years after I finished the film. I'm grateful that she lived to see the film, and I'm grateful that she was able to see this long-deserved recognition of this wonderful thing that her grandparents had done all these years later. And of course, for me, this project wound up being as much a tribute to Liz as it was to the legacy of her grandparents, and I'm grateful for that. Now, as for the children themselves, I call them children, even though by the time I was working on this project, they were well into their 70s and 80s. Um, and as you said, 9 of them appear in the film. It was such a great part of this whole project, getting to know so many of them. And when I was first doing the research for the film and beginning to put the film together, I was doing my best to find as many of them as I could, and I had a list of names, and often I would just enter the names into Google and just to figure out how I would find some of them, and I was luckily able to find a number of them. And often, I would get a hold of them, and here I was calling them out of the blue after all these years. I mean, some of these folks hadn't really thought much about this, perhaps in years and years and years. And here I was, this total stranger, asking them to relive this experience. But the kicker was, as soon as I was able to explain to them that my wife was the granddaughter of the couple that rescued them, that really was the icebreaker, and all of them were extraordinarily generous at that point in welcoming me into their homes, in agreeing to be filmed, and also in many cases they were very generous in sharing family photos and other mementos and things like that. So it was just it was a wonderful part of this whole project to get to know some of them and their families, and it just added, for me, it just added to the overall experience.
Do you know what happened to the other 41 children, and have you been able to talk to any who do not appear in the documentary?
Besides the ones that I met and interviewed for the film, I actually I'm trying to remember. I think I ended up having some contact one way or another with close to 20 of the 50 children while I was working on the film. I even filmed a couple of formal interviews with a couple of others, and for whatever reason, it didn't quite work to include them in the film. But the nice thing about this project is, and in part it was also because after I made the film, I ended up writing a book that went into much more detail about a lot of the children and their families. And so I got to know even more after the film had been made. But even in the years since, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which helped me considerably in some of the research that went into this project, they continued to be in touch with and to actually continue to sort of build a collection around this 50 children story. And in the course of doing that, some of the folks at the Holocaust Museum have continued to be in touch, have continued to reach out to a lot of these families. And in the course of doing that, they were able to account for really all but 1 or 2 of the 50. And so all these years later, we know a fair amount about what happened to pretty much all of the 50 children and their families. And again, it's been a real nice, lasting legacy that has grown out of this project.
Gilbert was very fortunate to discover the discrepancy between the number of Austrians who received visas to the United States and the number of Austrians who actually entered the country. Did Messerschmitt share the immigration quotas with Gilbert, or were they in the public domain? Similarly, in Vienna, the Jewish leaders had collected files on thousands of Jews who wanted to leave the country. Only the Nazis confiscated all the files. How did Gilbert get a hold of them?
Those are great questions, Olivia. And even with all the research that I did in the course of making the film, there were still some mysteries. And one of the great mysteries, and I can only really speculate to a certain degree about this, one of the great mysteries is really how did Gil come up with this idea of using these sort of unused or expired visas that otherwise were just going to basically get thrown away in order to bring the children back from Vienna into the United States. Gil was a lawyer and he was a smart guy, but it's not like he was an expert in immigration law or anything like that. And my best guess is that once he was in touch with a couple of folks at the State Department, and in particular George Messersmith, who by this time was the Assistant Secretary of State in Washington, D.C., and as opposed to a lot of other people in the State Department at the time, was pretty sympathetic about the plight of Jews under Hitler in Nazi Germany. I think what happened here is that Gil was sitting down with George Messersmith and a couple of other folks and talking about how they might do this and still stay within the letter of the law in terms of our immigration laws. And somehow during the course of those discussions, I think this notion of this discrepancy in terms of the visas must have come up. I actually wouldn't be surprised if that actually came from Messersmith himself, who would have known probably a lot more than Gil about the real ins and outs of what was going on at the time. But in any event, they came up with this scheme and it worked out. As for what was going on inside Vienna, once Gil got there, believe it or not, there was still an organized Jewish community that had been working ever since the Anschluss, ever since Hitler had taken over Austria the year before. The Jewish community in Vienna was organizing itself and was working at a fast and furious pace to help as many Jewish families get out as they possibly could. So even though the Nazis had confiscated all of the records and certainly controlled everything at that point, they were actually allowing the Jewish community in Vienna to kind of expedite this immigration process. So once Gil and Eleanor were in Vienna, they were actually working out of the Jewish community headquarters with full access to all those files that the Jewish community had collected, including the questionnaires and the application forms that all these families had already provided in an effort to get out. And it's one of the great things about this story that even under Nazi control, this Jewish couple from Philadelphia was able to work with other Jewish community leaders in Vienna to pick these 50 children and to get them out of Vienna and into the safety of the United States.
Can you tell us more about Brit Shalom, the Jewish fraternal organization Gilbert belonged to and that provided the beds to the children in its summer camp?
Well, Brit Shalom was a Jewish fraternal organization, similar to B'nai B'rith, a much more familiar organization that is still very much around. Brit Shalom was started in Philadelphia. It was founded by folks in Philadelphia in 1905, and within a few years had chapters up and down the East Coast and eventually all across the country. And in fact, at one point, it was a very large organization with tens of thousands of members all across the country, organized in local lodges and things like that around the country. But Philadelphia was where it was based, and in fact, Gil Kraus's father, Solomon Kraus, who himself was born and raised in Philadelphia and was a pretty successful guy in the real estate industry in Philly. Saul Kraus was one of the founding, very early members of Brit Shalom, going way back. And in the 1920s was actually the Grand Master, the national head of Brit Shalom. So this was an organization that Gil himself knew very well through his father, and Gil also had become very, very active in the organization. At some point, Brit Shalom built this summer camp in Collegeville, outside of Philadelphia. And the idea was that it would be a summer camp for the children of Brit Shalom members who could spend time in the summer there. And that's where the 50 children spent that summer after they came back from Austria, the summer of 1939. There was a large stone house on the property. Apparently, the story is that it was originally built not technically as part of the summer camp, but as kind of a senior citizens home, what used to be called an old folks home. It's a little unclear. It doesn't appear that it was ever actually used for that purpose. But the point is that there was this large house with, something like 25 bedrooms. I know it was a big place. And so Gil and Eleanor and other members of the British Shalom organization knew that would be a great place to keep the kids during that summer after they arrived from Vienna.
The documentary mentions that 3 of Philadelphia's most prominent Jews confronted Gilbert about his plans to go through with the mission. You didn't mention their names or if their concern was so much about the fact that this would bring too much negative attention onto the American Jewish community or appear too un-American. Could you talk about those who approached the Krauses and attempted to thwart their plans? Also, once the Krauses got back to Philadelphia with the 50 children, did these leaders of the Jewish community come back and apologize for how they treated the Krauses? Or even later, when they found out what happened in Nazi Germany and that 6 million Jews had been murdered, did they approach the Krauses then?
Yeah, the story of the opposition to the 50 children rescue mission, it's got different layers to it. Certainly, a big part of it, I think, really was this fear of a backlash. We're talking about a time in our history where there was really rampant anti-Semitism around the country. I mean, I think much more than exists today. There were public opinion polls that confirmed just widespread anti-Jewish attitudes, and not just against refugees and immigrants coming from Europe, but just very negative attitudes about Jews in this country. So I think some of the opposition was this idea of, well, let's not rock the boat because we know that the public doesn't really want to see Jewish refugees flooding into this country. So I think there was some of that. But there were some other issues going on too, and in terms of the Jewish leaders who were coming to Gil and Eleanor and trying to basically talk them out of doing this or saying this is not the thing to do. Some of that I think was simply because there was some jealousy involved. Gil was a member of was active in the British Shalom organization. But there were other organizations, other Jewish organizations that were trying to do similar things and just not succeeding. So I think there was some envy, some jealousy, some competition in a sense. And in particular, there were some Jewish community leaders right there in Philadelphia. There was a gentleman named Jacob Bilikoff who had been the longtime head of what was, I think, then called the Jewish Federation of Charities, which was essentially the current day Jewish Federation. And by 1939, Mr. Bilikoff had moved on to get involved in an organization, a national organization that was also trying to bring Jewish refugees out of Germany, and really not having very much luck. So I think there was, I think he was a little suspicious of who this guy Gil Kraus was. There was another guy who was the head of the Federation at the time, a guy named Kurt Pizer, who likewise was one of those who just basically said, this is not a good idea what you're doing, and we don't think you should proceed. What's interesting about Mr. Pizer is that a week or so after the Krauses and the kids arrived back from Germany, the British Shalom organization had its annual national convention at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City. Gil gave a speech, and the congressman from Philadelphia, Leon Sachs, gave a speech, praising Brish Shalom for what they had done. Well, Mr. Pizer also showed up at that convention, and this time he was also singing the praises of Brish Shalom for having carried out this great children's rescue mission. He didn't quite get around to mentioning that only a couple months earlier, he was one of those guys who had been imploring Gil and Eleanor to not proceed with this rescue mission. So, in hindsight, it's a little hard to imagine why or how anybody could have opposed this, but that kind of opposition was quite strong at the time.
Your documentary also demonstrates how fast the fate of the Jews in Vienna changed after the Anschluss on March 12, 1938, and Kristallnacht on November 9th and 10th, 1938. It only took weeks after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, for thousands of Jewish men to be rounded up and transported to death camps. The timeline is astonishing, and it really makes one realize how quickly violence escalates and levels up. In 1938, it was inconceivable to the Jewish community that the hatred towards them would end in their murder. This is a hard question, but in your opinion, with anti-Semitism on the rise here and abroad, what questions should we be asking ourselves right now? What questions should the Jewish community be asking itself? And further, what do we say when someone says to us, it can't happen here?
Well, you're right, Olivia. That really is the tough question that a lot of us grapple with these days. And it's interesting because I've done when I've shown this film around the country, almost always when we do the Q&A afterward, there's almost always someone who gets up and says, "See, it's happening all over again," and how can we stop it? And yes, we do know that anti-Semitism has never gone away, and almost certainly is increasing and is on the rise, both here in the United States and certainly in places in Europe. We know for sure. In the last couple of years, we've seen the tragic and horrifying events, things like the Tree of Life synagogue and the assault on the synagogue near San Diego a year or so ago. And it does make us wonder, well, can this happen again? I guess even given the current political environment, I'm a little bit more of an optimist. I think in our own country, it's hard for me to imagine that things could ever return to the kinds of things we saw in the 1930s. And when I say that, I certainly don't mean to minimize the seriousness of anti-Semitism, which we obviously know has always existed and probably will never go away. So those are the questions. I think those are the questions that we all have to grapple with. How do we confront anti-Semitism, whether it's here in our own country or elsewhere? But in terms of returning to the worst of the 1930s and the 1940s in terms of another Holocaust, I'd certainly like to think that that's not something we'll see once again.
After seeing 50 children for the fourth time, I cannot help but be in awe of Eleanor's immense bravery throughout the rescue mission. 1. She leaves a 9 and 13-year-old at home, not knowing if she's ever going to see her children again. 2. She travels alone on a ship from New York Harbor, setting sail to Paris to meet up with her husband, and then take an overnight train to travel to Berlin and then Vienna with SS troops everywhere they go, and huge banners with Hitler's likeness hanging right before them. 3, she enters Hotel Adlon, her and Gilbert's hotel, in the midst of Italy and Germany's Pact of Steel celebrations. And she walks into an elevator and stands a mere 3 inches away from the Nazi foreign minister von Ribbentrop and the son-in-law of Benito Mussolini, Aleazzo Ciano, who happens to be Italy's foreign minister. Eleanor went through some really scary shit, to be frank, and she didn't complain about it. She didn't question whether her and Gilbert did the right thing by taking this all on themselves, and she didn't even admit to being afraid. Which leads me to ask you, were there any journal entries that did reveal a bit of self-doubt or fear? And if you left them out, what was your reason for doing so?
I love that question. It's no one's ever asked me that before, to be very honest. And I guess I'd have to sort of go back and reread a lot of Eleanor's writing to sort of remind myself of what I left out. I certainly have a sense of, I can sort of think of obviously what's in the film, because I'm very familiar with pretty much everything that's in the film. It's a good question. There is a lot of great writing that she did, and so I sort of took the best bits of that in terms of some of the very emotional moments, and certainly some of the passages that you mentioned. A lot of it, to be honest, though, is kind of mundane. I mean, she'll talk about going on a shopping expedition or something like that, and just sort of everyday kind of stuff, which doesn't really fit into the sort of narrative of the 50 Children story. But come to think of it, there is something that I thought of including in the film, and I realized that it just got kind of into a level of detail that would have been difficult to sort of include in the film. Some folks watching the film might remember that at the very end, when Liz is talking about sort of summing up her grandparents, and she actually ends the film by saying, her grandmother did this incredible thing, even while wearing a really nice hat. And it brings a smile to people's faces. It's kind of a humorous way to end this very serious subject. Well, the backstory of all that is that Eleanor writes in a lot of detail about this hat that she bought in Philadelphia, kind of as a consolation to herself when she first realized initially that she was going to be left behind, that she wasn't going to go with her husband Gil. And I think she was a little disappointed, but probably also a little relieved at the time that she didn't have to go off to Nazi Germany and take on the risk of doing that. So she goes out and buys herself a fancy hat. Now, this is, we're talking about a woman who liked fashionable clothes, and she liked her pearls and her jewelry, and so she goes on and on throughout her writing about this hat. And indeed, once she does join her husband a couple of weeks later, she takes the hat and she writes even more about the hat. So by the time we get to the end of the film, and Liz has that great line about her grandmother and her hat, we don't really know the backstory of that, and I kind of grappled with that when I was making the film, but I think the line still works perfectly fine, even if folks don't know the full story of Eleanor and her hat.
What do you want audiences to take away from 50 Children?
I hope that people who see this film come away with a few things. One is, in telling the story of Gil and Eleanor Kraus and what they did in saving this group of children, I think their story helps, at least in some way, to kind of do away with one or two myths that still kind of surround the Holocaust to this day, and in particular in terms of the American response to the Holocaust. I think there's long been this notion that people in this country really didn't know what was going on in Europe, and that if we only knew, then yes, we would have stepped up and done more. Well, as I as I think I show in the film, um, uh, people did know what was going on. The newspapers were filled with stories about what was going on. Eleanor at one point says, we're reading in the newspapers about what's happening, and they were angry. Gil was angry that people weren't doing anything in response to that. So I think one sort of takeaway from the film is to remember what the real history was, and that is, yes, we did know what was going on, and unfortunately there weren't too many others like Gil and Eleanor. There certainly were others, but there weren't all that many people who were indignant enough to step up and try to do something about it. And I guess sort of a corollary to that, and maybe the broader takeaway from the film, at least for me and hopefully audiences as well, is to realize that in thinking about Gil and Eleanor Kraus, these were two relatively ordinary people. And I think the real powerful message of this story is that it reminds us that ordinary people always have the ability, or at least the potential ability, to do extraordinary things under the worst possible circumstances. And I think that's a message that is as powerful today as it was in the 1930s and 1940s. That whether it's dealing with something that's happening right in our own backyard, or whether it's something that's happening halfway around the world, all of us, as ordinary people, have the power to do extraordinary things. And for me, at least, that's probably the most powerful message that comes out of this story.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much for talking to GPJFF. My last question is about current projects. Your new film, Holy Silence, has just hit the festival circuit. Can you tell us about the film and any other projects that you're currently working on?
Well, thank you, Olivia. This has just been so terrific, being able to bring the film back to Philadelphia this way. It's been a great journey for me, and the opportunity to share the film with folks in the film festival community there it matters a whole lot to me. And yes, Holy Silence, my new film, was just at the beginning of its own film festival run when things started shutting down a couple months ago. So we'll see where that goes. We're all finding our way in the world, in the film world, as you know. And we're in these uncharted waters in terms of how we get our films out there. So we'll see where that goes. But I'm hopeful that one way or another, the film will make its way. Holy Silence is a film about the Vatican and its actions, and unfortunately its inactions in response to the Holocaust and the years leading up to the Holocaust. But like 50 Children, when I was working on Holy Silence, I wanted to find a sort of American angle into the story, and as a result, much of the film focuses on the kind of behind-the-scenes roles that a few different American officials. There's a Jesuit priest, for example. There's Franklin Roosevelt's personal envoy to the Vatican. There were some Americans who were working behind the scenes in an effort to influence actually two different popes at the time and how they were responding to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the oncoming Holocaust. So those are the issues that the film takes on. I'm proud of the film. I think it's a good film, and I hope it finds its way out into the world. And I'm now also sort of in the beginning stages. I've done a little production work on my next film. This one is not about the Holocaust, but it's It's a really good story about a little known story about an American Jewish family of long standing. They go way back for generations. But it's about this family that wound up not only owning but preserving, saving from ruin, Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, just outside of Charlottesville. So the film is going to focus on that story, but it's also going to tell us a little something about the history of anti-Semitism in our country. So it's going to wrap all those things together through this story of this Jewish family that owned and saved Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm just looking forward to continuing to share my films with the great folks there in Philadelphia. Thanks so much.
Thanks again, Steve, and thank you everyone who has tuned in tonight for this interview and to watch 50 Children. If you have any additional questions for Steve, please use Facebook Live's designated chat area to ask Steve your questions or to leave comments. And if you like what you see, please subscribe to GPJFF's YouTube channel to catch another episode of GPJFF in Conversation or new episodes of GPJFF's wonderful web series. Thanks again, and see you next time.